Our final seminar this afternoon is thanks to BVC title sponsor Perkins, Coie, with partner McQuesten and associate Christian Carlson here to talk. This is best practices for high growth companies. Corporate attorney McQuesten counsels clients from startups to established companies on corporate governance matters, securities compliance issues, and significant corporate transactions, and has particular experience advising startups on funding needs and works with issuers and investors in debt and equity financing transactions. In addition, Anne regularly represents buyers and sellers in mergers, acquisitions, and corporate reorganization transactions. Active in the Portland startup community, Anne serves on the board of directors for the Oregon Entrepreneurs Network and on the advisory board for the Mercy Corp's Northwest Women's Business Center, where she has also provided pro bono legal services and regularly presents seminars on business legal issues. She is also passionate about sustainability and has devoted time to the Oregon State Bar Sustainable Future section and is currently on the board of directors for the Eco School Network. Associate Christian Carlson has experience advising issuers and investment banks on numerous types of domestic and international capital markets transactions. Prior to joining Perkins Coie, Christian advised financial institutions in connection with offerings of structured products, including securities linked to equities, commodities, currencies, and interest rates. He draws on his experience in complex financial products to provide effective counsel to companies across a variety of industries. Perkins Coie, take it away.
Thank you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking through to the end here. And thank you for the introduction, much appreciated. We won't spend too much more time on that. This is us, and we're here today to talk to you about best practices for high growth companies. So kind of targeting the early stage companies that may be here as you're anticipating the growth that the potential investment that we're all hoping to receive will allow you to pursue. So we're just going to go through kind of high level some issues that we get asked about a lot for emerging companies, and then we'll leave some time at the end for questions to make sure that you have a chance to get as much information as you can while we're here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Christian.
All right. Thanks, Anne. As Anne said, it's going to be fairly high level. I'll spare you the legal jargon, and I'll refrain from any Latin phrases, that sort of thing. First, we're going to talk about just some human resources issues, insurance coverage, accounting needs, some compliance and document retention best practices, as well as corporate governance best practices as well. So the first thing to talk about, employee policies. First thing would be is develop an employee handbook. The importance of that is just making sure that you and your employees have an understanding of expectations, clear expectations, and just developing trust with your employees. And some things obviously that you're going to include in that handbook would be wage and hour, compensation, any sort of wage and hour issues, disciplinary issues, code of conduct, IT policies, that sort of thing. And so again, that's sort of part of developing a good relationship with your employees. And just in connection to that, it's you're going to want to think about creating sustainable policies for the long term. Just how are you going to attract and retain valuable employees, and just ultimately develop a really good company culture. One way to do that would be to institute some sort of employee feedback program. There's lots of sort of online tools, I understand, that you can use to again sort of elicit that feedback and just constantly hone and work on your company culture. Employment agreements. So the first thing I want to talk about is just use the right employment agreements. What I mean by that is you should have really two types. You should have an offer letter that you can use just generally for just your everyday employees. And then the second type is you're going to want to think about having a more fulsome employment agreement that you can use for executives. And that's obviously going to cover things like bonus, severance, that sort of thing. And obviously, you're going to want to talk to a lawyer about both of those, developing both of those agreements and just having good forms in general. In connection with employment agreements, we just wanted to mention that we should carefully consider in employing any sort of non-competes. Non-competes are a heavily regulated area, particularly in Oregon, California, and Washington. So you should just be very careful about using them, talk to a lawyer, yeah, someone like Perkins Coie. Additional issues. So obtain employment liability insurance. This is, so we've talked so far about really employing really good policies for your business, but there's only, these policies can only go so far, and so the question is obviously how do you protect yourself further? One way is employment liability insurance. So if your employee obviously gets injured on the job or there's some sort of illness in connection with the employment, it's important to have this insurance. The other thing to think about is just making sure you get the independent contractor employee distinction right. This is a very hot topic, obviously. There's lots of discussion in this area in terms of the gig economy, and I'm sure you're all very familiar. But the point being that lots of jurisdictions are looking into this. The requirements are going to be a little different by jurisdiction, and just the safe bet would obviously be to talk to a lawyer, but just to be safe, I would sort of assume that anyone sort of you're engaging for work is going to be an employee and subject to wage and hour requirements. Some additional issues. Complying with tax withholding requirements. Obviously, if you have an employee, you're going to need to withhold federal and state income tax and Social Security taxes. And then you're also going to need to have your employees fill out W-4s, and you're going to need to retain those records. Relatedly, it's important to comply with immigration and customs enforcement. So you're going to need to have your employees fill out I-9s. And if you run into any sort of foreign worker issues, visa issues, it's going to be important to talk to a lawyer about those issues. So moving on from the human resources side, I just wanted to touch on some insurance issues. Obviously, before we were talking about employment liability insurance, some additional sort of general insurance that you're going to want to have is going to be just general liability insurance, directors and officers insurance, an umbrella excess policy, that sort of thing. You're also going to want to think, like, what industry am I in? Are there specific things about my business, specific that's going to lead me to get additional insurance, like property insurance, obviously automobile insurance, that sort of thing. The final piece of insurance I wanted to talk about, and this one is not always obvious, is requiring third-party insurance. And what I mean by that is your vendors and your suppliers. The issue being that if you're going to want to assess your vendors and suppliers to see, like, is there a potential issue with their goods or services? Am I going to be able to recover against them? What sort of business are they? Do they have the capital, et cetera? Do they have the cash on hand? And relatedly, and so the question is, if not, you're going to want to get this you're going to want to require them to have this insurance, because what if, say, your customer sues you? How are you going to be made whole by bringing in this third party? Accounting needs. The point here is just that as your business grows, just to constantly be thinking about what sort of accounting needs do I have. and what am I going to need going forward. Obviously, you're going to want to talk to someone like our friends Jones and Roth, just to give a plug. And then additionally, just as you grow your business, you're going to want to think, well, do I need to bring someone in-house? What sort of finance or accounting personnel do I need to bring in-house? What do my financing agreements require in terms of producing financials, whether it be annual, quarterly, or monthly financials? And then also, it's also important to have your financials sort of well in order for any sort of subsequent financing rounds, that sort of thing. Compliance and document retention. I just wanted to say that, so you should review where you qualify to do business, where you have your customers, your vendors, your customers, your places of business, that sort of thing. It can ultimately trigger where you need to qualify to do business, where you need to pay taxes and make certain filings. So just keep that in mind. And obviously, as your business grows and evolves, just make sure that that is something that you're complying with, because that can lead to significant fines that you're going to want to avoid. The other thing to point out is just maintaining good company records. Earlier I was talking about the I-9s that you're going to want to collect from your employees, W-4s. You're obviously going to have business records with respect to bylaws, any sort of entity documents, shareholder agreements. And then as your business grows, you're going to have contracts. If you get a big cash infusion, your business is going to grow even further. And then you're going to, your contracts are going to grow exponentially. So just sort of have top of mind that you need to maintain good company records. You should have them well organized. I would suggest Dropbox, Google Docs, just a place that you can sort of deposit all of these documents and just have them in order. This is obviously going to be helpful for you to sort of just maintain your own sanity, but also subsequently in any sort of financing rounds, that there's going to be diligence, and just having this all ready to go is going to make your business look good, and it's going to be helpful.
All right. So next, we're just going to go through some frequently asked questions that we get. Now that you are a growing business, looking forward to a time when you've taken in some money, have additional shareholders on your cap table beyond just the founders, and you've maybe established a board of directors that may include representatives from your investors, and all of a sudden you have other people or entities to answer to beyond just yourself and your co-founders. And that can be a big shift in a company's mindset and a set of circumstances that you may not be too familiar with. And you want to make sure that you're taking all the right steps to make the right people happy and engaged and want to continue to support your business. So the first question here is, should I send out investor updates? Now, this is something that is not typically, necessarily required by any sort of contract that you enter into with an investor. There can be contractual requirements that you'll see in a financing round to provide regular financial statements and a budget for the company and that kind of thing. But this is more talking about just kind of in investor relations. What kind of communications should I have with my investors? And I would say the answer is generally going to be yes. Investors that receive regular information from you are going to build a level of trust with you, and they're going to feel like they made a good decision to invest in the company because they're staying informed and they know what's going on. It can also be very helpful to avoid the time that it takes when you're receiving just kind of one-off questions from investors. So if you're not communicating regularly, then at some point the investor is going to come to you and start asking you questions. And if you're getting that inbound inquiry from all of your different investors, that's a lot more time that it takes out of your schedule than sending a single investor update to everyone and just kind of clearing it off the table in one go. It can also be very helpful in terms of preparing investors for requests that you may make of them. So at some point, you're going to, we'll get to this later, but you're going to potentially need some shareholder approvals for actions that you take down the road. And it's a lot easier to go out and make those asks of investors and tell them that they need to send back their signatures within 24 hours on something if you've been regularly keeping them apprised of what's going on and they feel like they can, kind of trust that what they're signing is in line with the progress of the business. So what should go in investor updates and what's the cadence? That's sort of a little bit of a judgment call. A lot of companies will do maybe a quarterly investor update and include just sort of highlights since the last update, any major wins, but also consider including challenges that the company is facing or has faced or foresees facing in the near future, because that can build your credibility to sort of preview things that maybe aren't going so well before it comes to a point where the investor finds out about it from someone else, or it's gone to a critical stage where you could have sort of eased the conversation by addressing it earlier. So relatedly, we'll get the question periodically, do I need to hold an annual stockholder meeting? So both Delaware and Oregon law do require an annual stockholder meeting. And in practice, I would say probably the minority of early stage companies actually hold an annual stockholder meeting. So it's typically, not an issue. Investors typically don't make a big deal out of it, particularly if you are keeping them regularly informed. But it is something that, you can consider. Is it a good way to have sort of an annual time when you can get on a Zoom call and give an investor update live? And generally, the key action item at an annual meeting would be to elect the board of directors. Whatever other action you might need the shareholders to take, but that's sort of the typical annual item. Having said that, your board will continue to serve until they're removed or otherwise resign if you don't hold an annual meeting. So again, this is something that you technically should do under corporate law, but it's not always in practice something that companies will do, particularly at early stages. So that's stockholder meetings. What about board meetings? Should you hold these? How regularly should you hold them? Once you have a board of directors that includes, potentially representatives from your investor group or independent third-party investors, it's a good idea to establish a regular cadence of board meetings. The right number is kind of, case by case, and you can sort of feel out and discuss with your board what that is. Many companies will do quarterly or, maybe 6 investor or board meetings each year. Some will do monthly. I, work with some companies where they'll want to meet with the board every month on a formal basis. Sometimes this will actually be dictated by the investment documents that you sign. So that's another thing to kind of keep in mind when you're going through an investment process. What's the requirement for regular communication and meetings with the board as well as the stockholders? But beyond just kind of the formal regular board meetings, consider just, informal check-ins with your board, whether that's by email or just an informal call with one or more members of the board. These people are, they're on the board to serve the company and to provide advice to management. So use those board members in that way as much as is beneficial to you and the company to get that advice, even if it's not necessarily within the context of a regular board meeting. All right, so now we've decided you're going to have your regular board meetings. What do you do to be prepared for the board meeting? What's a typical agenda? And what are some best practices for preparing for and conducting a board meeting? So typical agenda for a regular board meeting, which is kind of your regularly scheduled, maybe quarterly meeting, would be just sort of housekeeping items, approving the minutes from the last meeting, setting the schedule for the remainder of the board meetings, taking attendance, making introductions maybe to new members of the management team that have come on board since the last board meeting. Probably the bulk of most regular board meetings for a company that's not engaged in, at a time when you're engaged in a significant transaction or have, other material events going on, would be just business updates. So having different functional areas of the company come in and give an update on what's happening, what are the results from the last 6 months or 3 months or whenever the last board meeting you had was, reporting out to the board and answering questions of the board. So that's going to be a big piece of the time. Other aspects would be just going over the financial statements of the company for the period leading up to the board meeting, so that the board is apprised of, what's the cash situation. That's always a big one, because the board needs to know as soon as possible, when there's an issue with cash and how they need to be thinking ahead to making sure that there's adequate cash flow for the company. Talking about key updates to the team, HR updates, headcount, any, HR issues or needs to potentially, reduce the headcount coming up is a good topic for a board meeting. And then any sort of, significant pending or in-process matters, if you need to approve or start thinking about approving a financing transaction or a loan transaction, those are important items to bring to the attention of the board, as soon as you are aware of them. Ordinary course corporate approvals are another good thing to take care of. So a lot of companies that have a stock option program will, instead of, granting stock options sort of as new people come into the company, they'll wait till, the quarterly meeting and just approve a slate of stock options, for example. And that's something that the board would always approve and can be an action item at a board meeting. And that can be either, at the regular board meeting, or sometimes boards function well to go into executive session where management, other than the member, anyone that's on the board, leaves the meeting and it's just the core board, and you can do those board approvals and then also discuss any sort of more sensitive topics that you may not want the rest of the team around for. Actually, I'm going to go back here really quickly and just touch on a few, beyond just kind of setting the agenda, a few best practices for while you're doing the board meeting. So really the function of the board is to oversee the high-level operations of the company. It's not, management on a day-to-day basis, but the board is responsible to be informed, know what's going on with the company, and assist management with making directional and critical decisions about the company. And so these board meetings are a really critical way for you as management, and for any investors that are here as potentially members of the board, to make sure that you're fulfilling those duties and remaining informed. So you want to make the best uses you can of those board meetings, because that's a good opportunity to make sure you're just fulfilling that duty that the board has. So one, just making sure that everyone that's on the board is regularly attending the meetings. And a good way to accomplish that is just setting the schedule in advance, making sure that people have it on their calendars and are prepared and ready to come and be present for the meeting, that they're not in their car if at all possible, and can focus on the matters at hand. Making sure that you have the right people at the meeting to adequately present on what they're presenting. So if you've got a key marketing update, make sure you have the people that are responsible for the marketing function at the meeting. Same with HR and finance. And that's a really, a great way, one, to take the pressure off of, the C-suite and bring in some of the functional leaders to actually contribute and take ownership of the areas of the business that they're responsible for. Make sure you have enough time scheduled to make sure you cover all those things and leave enough time for feedback from the board and any sort of corporate approvals you want. I can't tell you how many times we've sort of gotten to the end of a scheduled board meeting and had to really sort of rush through the last few items. And to the extent you can avoid that, it's a good idea. Make sure you're distributing information that the board is going to be asked to consider as far enough in advance as possible. And that includes if you're asking for any sort of corporate approvals, including stock options, like I mentioned, any sort of corporate transaction, try to get the resolutions that they're going to be asked to approve to them as soon as possible. And where we come into that is tell us that you need that, and we'll get it prepared for you and ready to distribute to the board in advance. So communication with your lawyer, and if you need someone from other external advisors to participate, make sure you've got that communication happening as early as you can. Another point on how to leverage your outside advisors in a board meeting is consider asking your corporate counsel to come and attend the board meeting. This is a great way to, one, make sure you have the right people there to answer questions if you are being asked to consider corporate transactions, but also we can take your minutes for you and not have you be trying to be the note keeper and the presenter at the same time. And a lot of corporate counsel will just attend your board meeting at no cost if it's on a reasonable cadence, because it's beneficial to us too to kind of know what's going on with the company. And that way we're not kind of surprised when we hear things. And we can also flag issues if we hear like, hey, yeah, we're hiring this investment banker. We can step back and say, okay, well, can you send us the investment banker agreement so we can review it? That's something we have expertise in, and we never would have necessarily known that if we hadn't been at the board meeting. I mentioned minutes. So another key aspect of your board meeting is going to be to make sure that you keep good minutes. Again, something that if you do have counsel at the meeting, you can certainly ask them to do. The minutes are kind of your evidence of what the board considered, and that it did actually, going back to the duties of knowing what's going on in the company and deliberating about key decisions. That's where you record that the board actually fulfilled that obligation. However, it's not a place to put a verbatim outline of what was said in the board meeting. So it's a balance, and it's something that your counsel again can kind of coach you on what the right level of detail to include in board minutes might be. All right, so composition of the board. We often get asked, people will hear the phrase independent director. Do we need one of those? It's not necessarily a requirement. It is something that sometimes in your financing agreements that they'll set out what the composition of the board will be. So that might be, the founders plus a representative of the investors plus an independent director or two independent directors. If that's the case, then it is a requirement just by virtue of the contract that you've entered. But absent that, it's just something that some boards find to be beneficial by bringing in an outside person who often has some sort of industry expertise or some other sort of special expertise that they can bring to the board that other members might not have. And it's typically someone who's not necessarily involved in the management of the company or an investor in the company, but just sort of as the name implies, an independent party that can bring value to the board. So one thing to just keep in mind too with independent directors and board members generally, if you have kind of the founding team and you have investors on the board, they're not necessarily going to expect additional compensation. case by case, but that's kind of a typical philosophy from investors is, we're on the board to monitor our investment and have our say and our oversight of how the company's going. So it's not a necessarily additional service that we're expecting compensation for. Independent directors may have a different view, so it's not unusual for, if you have a stock option program, for example, to issue stock options to an independent director. So if you get asked that question, just something to think about as you're potentially thinking about who might be a good independent director and what you can offer them in exchange for their service. And last year, so we've established again, we want to maintain contact with our stockholders and keep our board involved. What is actually required for us to go to the stockholders and the board to approve versus just sort of best practices for keeping people informed and apprised of what's going on? So this is something that, there may be requirements that are in your investment documents again. So contractual obligations or obligations that are in your charter that say, if you want to do X, you have to go and get the approval of your stockholders. Absent that, generally speaking, for any sort of amendments to your key organizational documents, your charter, your bylaws, you would want to go to the board and stockholders for approval. Board approval also, think about just sort of any material contracts, so like a new loan, go to the board and get approval. Any sort of out of sight of the ordinary course transactions, good time to go to the board and get approval. For stockholders, they're going to be the ones who approve the board slate and the board size, board composition. And once you get to the point where you're considering a major transaction, say a merger or a sale of the company's assets, that's a point where you would also need to go to the board and the stockholders for approval. So all those things to say, it's just sort of a non-exclusive list of things to sort of keep in the back of your mind as they come up, but also something that there may be various sources of where those requirements are. It could be the law of the state where your company's organized. It could be your charter documents, or it could be agreements that you have with your investors. So if there's ever a question in your mind of, does something need approval, another good place to go is just go to your corporate counsel and ask them, and they'll be able to give you the answer rather than having to guess. And that's it. So I'm happy to field any questions now.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Christian. This was a lot of information. So I'm thinking, yes, there we are, question in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious, what's your opinion on making audio or video recording of board meetings and or stockholder meetings?
Okay, so
No question about what actually went down.
So this is a great question, and just as a reminder, I'm going to repeat the question into the microphone when it comes from you all for our virtual guests. So he's asking, what do you think about doing an audio or audiovisual recording of board minutes so that there's absolutely no question about what went down, as he said, in the meeting?
Yeah. Generally speaking, I would not recommend it. Kind of to the point of you don't want your minutes to be too detailed. A recording of the meeting is kind of the epitome of that. And, there may be privileged conversations going on if you have counsel there. And the recording is going to be worst case scenario evidence if a stockholder comes back and is unhappy about something that happened. I think, you want to make sure that there's a atmosphere in the boardroom that enables candor and free discussion of ideas, and having a video or audio recording of it, I think in most circumstances just sort of dampens that a little bit.
Thanks, Anne. Other questions? Yes, from the same gentleman.
With respect to the
Okay, so with respect to investors, how careful do you want to be putting speculative information into your board meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think in your investor updates, you don't necessarily need to go to projections. If there's something that you feel like is important to communicate to your shareholders that hasn't yet happened but is anticipated to happen, I think you can mention it, but you want to be careful in how you frame it, and make sure it's clear that it is speculative and not guaranteed, so that investors understand that you're not making promises in that way. I wouldn't treat it the same as like a pitch to a new investor, where there may be more sort of projections, where you also want to have adequate disclosures and disclaimers, but existing investor reports, I think you can err more on the side of what the actual state of the business is.
It's like a one in the hand versus two in the bush type of.
Exactly.
That's where we are with that one. I think I saw another hand. Oh, yep.
Yeah, so in terms of like early team equity incentives where people are maybe sacrificing cash for equity, what have you seen as some like the most kind of either popular or effective types of equity increase?
Well, so this is such a fascinating question. So early startup, you have non-cash team incentives. What are some of the things that have been effective or that work or that are popular? So things that are other than like your full-on compensation.
Yeah, so I think by far the most common form of equity incentive would just be stock options, because they can be structured in a way that is beneficial to the employee or the service provider from a tax perspective. And it's something that an investor coming in will see a reasonably sized stock option pool and stock option grants and feel good about that because that's what they're used to seeing. There may be circumstances where other alternatives are appropriate, but I would say kind of rule of thumb is just a stock option plan with option grants. To supplement the cash compensation, of course, you always want to make sure you're paying at least minimum wage to your employees.
Yeah, that fancy stapler just isn't going to cut it. Yes?
So on stock options, how often does the company need an appraisal? If they're issuing stock options on a regular basis, is it every single time they issue a new stock option or just an annual?
So when a company is issuing stock options, how often do they need an appraisal as they're continuing to reissue?
Well, it depends, but there's a sort of tax. This is a tax question, and there's a safe harbor under the tax code that says that if you get an outside valuation of your shares, that you can rely on it for 12 months. The thing to keep in mind there, though, is that if there are sort of material events that happen within that 12-month period, you should consider whether it's reasonable to continue to rely on it. So if you get an appraisal and it sets a particular value, and 6 months later you raise money at a $100 million valuation when that wasn't contemplated in the or a $5 million valuation or whatever for that matter, and that wasn't contemplated when the appraisal was originally done, you may need to get a new appraisal sooner than 12 months.
So it depends. Any other questions? I think we can take one or two more for Aaron and Christian. Anybody? Okay. Well, as a reminder, you do have the opportunity to sign up for our one-on-one sessions, and I will show you that slide in just a moment. I want to say thank you to Anne and thank you to Christian. This was awesome. That's a lot of information. So I think hopefully we should let that settle and we'll see where we get next. I feel like I'm like a business expert now, so I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Good. Yeah, that's the objective. And we'll be around the rest of the conference too. And Joe Bailey is with us as well. So flag any of us if you have questions and want to chat throughout the event.
All right. Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Christian.